people from all over. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Alison Delnor. I'm the Interim Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm happy to convene this and welcome you all to our session on the Conversations on Europe, which is a monthly series funded in part by our Erasmus program grant from the European Commission and through a National Resource Centers grant from the US Department of Education. This semester, as part of our year of Recovering Europe, we are using the Conversations on Europe series to explore the idea of reckoning with the past. And today's session is the second to engage this topic. Last month in January, we examined the ways in which students, educators, and researchers throughout Europe are working to decolonize the curriculum, what that means in Europe, as opposed to in the United States, and what implications it has for European studies in both Europe and the US, more particularly. Today, we will continue the theme, but shift our focus to spaces that we all have visited, I'm sure, museums, to explore why, in what ways, and to what degree of success European museums are being decolonized. This session is possible thanks to support from our many partners, many of which are part of the Jean Monnet in the USA network of EU-funded centers and universities throughout the United States. But I must give special thanks to our special partners who help promote this and who are probably watching even as we speak: the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet European Center of Excellence at Florida International University, the EU Center at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida, and the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas, Austin, as well as the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta. Also, thank you to the Global Studies Center here at Pitt, as well as the Institute for International Studies and Education, also at Pitt, for co-sponsoring today's panel in particular. I also would not want to let pass a chance to thank my colleagues, Iris Matievich and Kenny Riley, for their help organizing and carrying out today's session. A quick note that we will be encouraging audience participation. We hope that you will be a part of the conversation, and we encourage people to submit questions through the Q&A function on the in Zoom. So we will be monitoring the chat as well, but most questions hopefully will go through Q&A. It's a little bit easier for us to track and sort through. I'm going to be I have the great pleasure of introducing our panel and our moderator, and I'm excited to welcome these distinguished guests to discuss this topic, which I've been very eager to do and which we've been trying to do for the last 2 years. We'll make mention of that later. So I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in turn briefly. The introductions are brief in order to allow more time for conversation, but longer bios will be available on our website as these videos are recorded and uploaded onto our website, along with resources and recommendations for further reading, so that they can serve as a resource for the general public and for educators as well. So joining us today, we have Sumaya Kassim, an independent researcher and writer who served as the co-creator for Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery's decolonial exhibition, Birmingham and the British Empire, The Past is Now, in 2017 and 2018, the experience of which prompted her to write a widely read article, widely circulated, entitled "The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized." She's given talks across the UK and in Europe, and her archival and textual interventions have been exhibited internationally. Welcome, Sumaya. I'm also pleased to welcome Erika Lehrer, a professor in history and sociology anthropology at the Concordia University in Canada. Dr. Lehrer is a sociocultural anthropologist and curator, as well as the founding director of the Curating and Public Scholarship Lab. Her research explores issues around, as the title of one of her edited volumes explains, curating difficult knowledge. So glad you could join us, Erika. Also joining us today is Aline Nyirahumure, who is the coordinator of the African Cultural Center, KUUMBA, known as the Flemish Africa House in Brussels. KUUMBA is a space promoting education exchange and dialogue between African and Flemish culture. And Aline is originally from Rwanda, with others in the African diaspora community in Belgium, has been an outspoken critic and collaborator with revisions to the Royal Museum for Central Africa, and an advocate and activist for correcting historical memory related to the colonial period. And we thank you very much for being here, Aline. Last but not least, we are also joined by Dan Hicks, a professor of contemporary archaeology at the University of Oxford, curator of the Pitt Rivers Museum, and fellow of St. Cross College, Oxford. His most recent book, The Brutish Museums, The Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, was published in November 2020, and we look forward to hearing more about that as well as other research. So welcome, welcome, Dan. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this conversation, which will be moderated by my colleague and friend here at the University of Pittsburgh, Professor Maureen Porter from the School of Education. Dr. Porter is the Associate Director of the Institute for International Studies and Education and an anthropologist interested in developing place-based and culturally inclusive pedagogies. She's currently working with Catherine Sieg and Hélène Depois on a special issue of Europe Now, which is the Journal for the Council of European Studies, on decolonizing European museums and memorials. And we may hear more about that shortly. We had been planning a conference on this topic with Dr. Porter in April 2020, which was canceled due to the pandemic. So I'm particularly pleased to be exploring the decolonization of museums in Europe through our Conversations on Europe series, and that we've been able to finally convene this conversation. So without further delay, then I will turn the floor, or rather the spotlighted screen, over to our moderator, Dr. Porter. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Allison, for turning it over. And I really look forward to having this opportunity to convene with everyone. As Allison has said, this has been a long time in the works. This is not a new topic here in the European Area Studies here at the University Center for International Studies and at Pitt in general. And I'm very excited to have this the second of two parts on a decolonizing series within the Recovering Europe emphasis for this year. And I think this is really part not just of recovering Europe, but reimagining Europe or reawakening Europe. And so I'm excited to have this very diverse set of colleagues to speak to many aspects of the applied and challenging questions and the impetus and the moral principles behind moving into, through, and beyond decolonizing museums. I'm going to start with Erica to pose a question that then will expand to everyone, thinking about the role of museums in the making of Europe. And Erica, could you talk about the role that museums have traditionally or now are playing in the creation of or imagining the nation state?
Sure, I will take a crack. But first, let me say thank you so much for this invitation. It's really exciting to be here. And I'm humbled to have the first go on this issue in my esteemed company here. So because I was teaching actually last night, I'm going to essentially pull a few bullet points from my slides, which are kind of still dancing in my head. And I'm sure my colleagues will elaborate then from their own professional perspectives. So here's like my professor lecture hat for the first question. So, I always try to provoke my students by using Carol Duncan's wonderful phrase to tell them that museums are institutions of deceit. That, in their modern form, they're institutions that present themselves as these objective, neutral, universalist, secular spaces that create this illusion of equality and access to common things and values. But of course, they are simultaneously doing quiet, deeply political work that is not being advertised. So of shaping visitors' perspectives so that histories of greed and plunder and violence are erased, and homogenous national collectivities and human hierarchies with European nations, of course, at the top are naturalized. And in this way, they're sort of part of like modernity's toolkit in that they combine the ability to create publics, so along the lines of Benedict Anderson's imagined communities, and with the ability to kind of control these publics and school them into particular ways of looking at each other and at the rest of the world. So this is like Foucault's, disciplinary institutions along with prisons and asylums. But there are a couple of other aspects I want to just sort of open up. One is that if national museums served the efforts of consolidating power in Europe via colonial collecting and white supremacy and exclusivist identities, in the 19th century, they also served as like tools for smaller national or minority groups. And here I'm thinking of from the perspective of Eastern Europe, where I work. So in these smaller groups to attempt to materialize their own aspirations to sovereignty and to territorial statehood that they had been denied by these empires that ruled over them. And this was the case, for example, for a number of Polish national museums that were established during the century and a half when there was no Poland on the map of Europe. And it's even the case for Jewish communal collecting projects within that context, so to try to express minority sovereignty as well. And like maybe the last thing I want to say in response to this question about what purpose museums have served is that they, of course, have also served to make many people feel deeply alienated from the nation by virtue of the particular ways that people are included in or excluded from the museum. And I want to jump ahead in time and note that this is not only true of like traditional 19th century disciplinary institutions, which may dominate, I think, a lot of our conversation today, perhaps. But an example is also like the new Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which has created some very problematic exclusions by the way that they tell Aboriginal stories without discussions of settler colonial violence, or the ways that they perpetuate European cultural normativity in the way that they try to include, but how they frame stories of like LGBT inclusion, right? So this is something that this inclusion and exclusion is not only an issue for these disciplinary museums, but even museums that are trying to take an utterly different tack. So that's my opening volley. Thank you.
Well, that's certainly a very effective volley to be able to say why museums have such a critical role in shaping states, in defining who belongs, whose stories need to be told. Sumaya, can you continue that conversation talking about why museums matter and why it would even then be so important for public conversation about decolonizing those kinds of spaces, if that's even something we should do?
Thank you, Erica. That was so hard to follow. I think whether museums matter, I mean, they simply are, firstly. So they're not, I think there's this idea that museums are kind of, there's this question of like, will they disappear, won't they disappear? I think it's quite obvious that they're here to stay. One aspect I think we don't talk a lot about in these conversations is that museums are useful as third spaces. And, I often get told, well, I take my children on the weekend to museums and I spend time with my family in them. And in the UK, a lot of very big museums are free to visit, which in these times, being able to sort of engage with an educational resource that is free is invaluable. I think at the same time, when I hear that, I part of me just goes, oh my goodness, but when I go into a museum, I don't feel educated in the way that I think people feel when they say that to me. So I'm very sympathetic to when people say that museums are helpful, or that they're spaces where we can connect or communicate with people that is non-commercial, for instance, although that's changing as well. I think that different people that go into a museum experience museums very, very, very differently. I think that if you came from a former colony, for instance, it's likely, or I mean, I don't want to speak for everyone, but it's likely that when you go in, you will find it can be traumatizing. So for me, if I give as an example, when I was growing up, I went to the Imperial War Museum, which is one of the most egregious examples of this. And I was absolutely floored by the cognitive dissonance that the visitors seemed to have about the weaponry, because people were very interested in the way that weapons worked. Most of them were white men and boys. The ways weapons worked and the way that weapons, the kind of history in that kind of the minutiae type of way, and seemed to sort of be completely disconnected from the idea that firstly that these, that people were being had been killed by these things, but also that people were being killed. That, you know, so one of the more recent things they had was a 2003 tank that had gone to Iraq, for instance. And I think that people sort of seemed quite disconnected from that. And at the moment we have this, there's a kind of call to recognize that when we talk about colonialism, it isn't something that happened a long time ago, but something that is happening today. And I think that, so when we say, do museums matter, what's quite interesting about museums is that on an emotional level, they, you know, they represent kind of the emotions of that colonialism is now, in that they still embody that trauma, but also sort of tangibly that there are these objects that may represent the theft of colonialism. They may represent the emotional theft, or the fact that when we talk about something having been stolen from a community, for instance, it's actually also the stolen possibilities, I think, that museums represent, in terms of, I guess, if you I think, I don't know if Erica mentioned the idea that museums categorize, but they sort of organize our realities in other ways, not just in terms of, they're not just places to visit, basically, is what I mean. So yeah.
Indeed, there are places where, as Dan has also written, that the past is very much present, that they're not just about things that were long ago or could be categorized or organized and as you said, created and displayed in a hierarchy, but they are things that are very much live, relevant, and continue to be able to bring up controversial issues that we have purposely not dealt with. So Dan, I was wondering if you could continue to add on to that, talking about how museums in Europe are important because they can be sites for exploring controversial and certainly even divisive issues. Why do those museums matter?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's really wonderful to be here. And I have to say initially, just what an honor it is to be here alongside this esteemed group. I want to just reflect on the question, though. I think it's a problematic frame that you offer. That frame of divisive issues or things that maybe we need to balance in sort of two ways. I think that's actually really risky. So I noticed that we didn't start today with a land acknowledgement, but we could have done, of course. We could have observed that you know, it's a conversation hosted in part on ancestral unceded land. Here in Europe, of course, that isn't the question. Instead, it isn't about stolen land, it's about stolen art, stolen culture, you know, and increasingly that sense of how extractivist colonialism leads into stolen environments as well. So these are not issues, I think, that should be presented as divisive. I think you know, that these issues over recognizing history in its full and unfinished form, and I think the absolutely central role of the cultural institutions, you know, that are museums for, you know, anti-racism and for sort of equality, you know, these are not things that we should be arguing about. These are not, we should not be entertaining the other side of the conversation. This is not contested. Instead, I think what's going on is that we're actually sort of waking up to the way in which our museums, and I think more generally, you know, arts and culture were put to work for a surprisingly narrow period of time between, let's say, the 1880s and the 1930s for the purposes of a very specific role in terms of seeking to create a myth of sort of cultural whiteness and of that cultural whiteness as sort of superior. So that, I think, the recognition, and we go to Fanon for this, you know, we go to the essay that he wrote on sort of racism and culture, where he makes a distinction between the vulgar racism that maybe we saw with the natural history museums, with the fake race science. But he argues in that essay from the 1950s that really soon, sort of after the emergence of that form of racism, there was another form, which is sort of cultural racism, which is the idea of human difference that's based on sort of culture and art and things that maybe we experience as a statue in the street or as an object in a museum, which is far harder to reckon with. So we're in this really interesting and exciting moment where we're recognizing those histories. We're seeing how museums have been involved in sort of those histories, but also have been involved in making that certain way of seeing the world last. So we're living not only with the legacies of empire in those ways, but we're living with institutions that were built in order to naturalize those ideas and to make them last. So I think that for those reasons, I would really push back a little bit on that framing that in the museums we're talking about things that are divisive. This is absolutely sort of centrally simply about social justice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for bringing that. And thank you also for bringing up the land acknowledgement. We do that within our School of Education and within my courses, of course, as an anthropologist. That isn't something we had been thinking about within this series, but it certainly is something we should carry over into this space also. And the larger exercises we do also, not just about why land acknowledgements are important, but and what else is necessary. That's simply playing, you know, here's my obligatory sentence, here's my new museum curation sign, here is my new display disclaimer, that those actions are not enough, that decolonizing and reckoning and coming to reconciliation and social justice action does require quite a lot more. And I think that that's part of our thinking in pulling together this panel. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Aline next about the ways that people who are having different roles, who are inside museums, who are outsiders, who are working as community activists, who are also trying to do things and rethink what museums are even for, are here today with us. So we can start with that question of what is going on with museums? How are your experiences helping us to understand the key roles of making them not just the voice pieces of empire makers, but of a wider constituency? And you're speaking to us from the Brussels area, right?
That's it. Thank you, Maureen. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be able to be part of this conversation for sure. I have heard a lot of interesting points, and especially from being somebody from a really recently country that had a civil war, and knowing about, well, learning, not knowing, but especially learning and being educated by museums, by people here in Belgium. It's something that when I got the question to be participating with this conversation, I was like, yeah, museums. So what are museums for me? About the fact that it's where the knowledge is, or it's actually where that teachers are actually educating us, that tell us that that's where you can get the knowledge. That's how actually myself, like after my studies, when I started traveling in every country, the first thing that you do when you want to learn about the country is look for a museum. It's not that I'm going to read a book. It's actually look for the museum and go visit the museum and go see, so what can I learn from this museum and what can I learn about the country? And so it's somewhere that people, it's always been said like knowledge is power, because the ability to acquire this knowledge, preserve it, and pass it on the next generation, that's what a museum does. And that's where that a certain society, or well, I say a certain range of race, as they call it. I don't like the word, but that's the word that a lot of people use. That's how you remain as powerful as you want to, by making sure that the knowledge that you acquire and you give to the next generation is the knowledge that helps you to stay on that place that you want to remain. So it's something that when I think about museums, I always wonder, like, shouldn't be they telling another story? Should they be still telling stories that the society today perceives as not right, perceived as colored, as not something that we all see ourselves in, or something that traumatized as well a part of the society. I think it's Sumaya who worded like, sometimes it's traumatizing to go into a museum and seeing things and thinking like, oh, how does this feel for me? For me, it was very traumatizing visiting the Royal Museum here in Belgium, because the first thing, because I even organized like a tour guide so that somebody could tell me about things and not just read about it. And it was very traumatizing that the first thing that they said about my own culture was the fact that we didn't have a rich culture. And I was like, oh my God, that what have I been doing all these years? What have my parents been telling me all these years? Like, how can my culture not be rich, or as rich enough as the white person telling me wants me to think that it is? And it's all those kind of things that I think that for society, for us youngsters and even next generation diaspora, we do want to be represented in museums as well. We don't want to see the same thing going on year after year and having to hear the same story, and our kids having to hear the same story, because if you know, education, museums are like a support for education. Teachers use them to be able to get their point across, to be able to visualize what they're talking about. Like, it's not just in art classes that museums are important, it's as well in social classes, it's as well, when I think in history classes, I think especially history is something that uses museum as a way of making kids get more knowledge about what happens. I think when I see myself and I remember like, what kind of education did I get, and which museums do we visit year after year, I always find myself thinking back and going back to the fact that I never saw myself in those museums. I always saw a story that didn't include me in the whole thing that they were saying, or that made me being the black sheep of the whole story as well. And that's something that when we talk about it, we find that, yeah, what's at stake in museums, there is a change that's needed. There is a change that's needed. And that change is not anymore something that can be ignored. There is movement coming up. There are people speaking up, even teachers, professors. I think today is a really nice example of a group of people that really recognize it and that can speak up together with us as well in that change to come. I think there is one thing that I have always gotten when I'm critical about museums here in Belgium is the fact that, but when we do something, it's lost of information, or like the artifacts, if we would give it back, it will be a loss because then we cannot tell the story. I'm like, telling a story or keeping something that you stole is not the same thing. Like, you stole it. It's not, you cannot anymore make believe people that it's something that you took because the society that you took it from is not civil enough. No, it's the way you used to think. It's the way that you thought that I'm civil and the other person isn't. For today, we do recognize other culture next to our culture that we have. And it's something that we need to recognize as well in museums, and that we need to let go and not just hold on the fact that, and give the impression to people that the reality that they perceive in museums, that's the reality that it is today. That's for me kind of an important point, is that stolen cultures, stolen artifacts are not something that you can just continue using to tell a story, where that you indoctrinate people, if I would say like that, where you actually just put in their mind to keep on thinking the way that they used to think, so that you can have this powerful structure that you want to keep. And that's the thing that I want to see changed for sure, that also my kids, as me, myself, we can see ourselves as well in all those museums represented, and the story being told right, not just being told like we did a good thing, because that's most of the museum is, it's a good thing what we are telling you here. No, please be as clear as possible that it's about actually atrocity that happens. It's about populations that were killed. It's for me, I always say, when people tell me that, I say, like, so do we still perceive like World War I or World War II as something that's positive? No, we don't. So why should we still perceive that colonization was something that was positive? No, let's be honest, it's as well something that killed a lot of people. So let's come back to earth and talk about it as well, and make conversation and make sure that we can recognize what happened, and make sure that that recognition of what happened comes together with a sense of change in everything that we do. And that's the same thing with museums as well.
Aline, thank you so much for adding into this this wonderful introduction from everyone. And I see Erica's hand is up, and I also want to link here to Vukovic's comment in the question and answer, because we wanted to think more about what does that change look like in person, whether it's telling stories and displaying objects or even holding objects, the kinds of curation and things that are done as part of public education. Vuk asks, you know, I think it's great to have this conversation about Europe's reckoning with its colonial past concerning art museums, but how can Europe set an example to the rest of the world when it cannot resolve internal issues such as repatriation of Elgin marbles? So I know several of you have very clear things to say about that, and I'll start with Erica, since you have your hand up, if you have something related to that piece about what is it that European museums are actually doing well or are doing to resist, implement, or redefine decolonization that could make them examples and that you have been thinking critically about.
Okay, I mean, I actually wanted to just I was just listening to kind of my colleagues talking, and I had some reflections around kind of I think it's so interesting because you can hear at once this tension between, you know, so how terrible museums are and have been, but also kind of their potential, that they're filled with so much incredible stuff. I mean, they also have this potentially to be wonderful. And it's really the question, like, is it possible to change how museums do museology or museumness in a way that makes what they have and what they are into something that would work for us rather than against us, I would say. And so, you know, I think there's this real contradiction. On the one hand, they're monuments to global injustice, right? I mean, they are these incredible monuments, which are so important for teaching about their own histories. They're these like underexplored containers at the same time of all of these untold stories, right? Of intergroup interaction across the globe. And so I think, and in my curatorial work, I'm making attempts to sort of reclaim museums in the service of telling new kinds of stories, you know, about our various selves. Of course, this question of restitution, and I mean, that's really, you know, that's Dan's real purview. Like, that's a starting point, of course. Like, I mean, restitution is a must. But I feel like we can't, if we focus only on that, we really leave museums off the hook as meaning-making institutions, because all that would happen is they would fill themselves up again with objects perhaps gotten in, you know, less unjust ways, and then they would apply the same faulty colonial interpretive frameworks to those objects. And so we would just simply be perpetuating this. So the question is, like, can we create some sort of intercultural museum spaces that balance the perspectives of all of the people who are implicated in them with the full baggage of history? And I think, you know, I think maybe one important aspect here is we really need we need new concepts of what is our idea of our heritage, right? Because heritage, I think, as a notion, both in scholarship often, but also in terms of like what's taught in schools and what's in the popular mind and how governments deploy it, it's always seen as this celebratory, it's something positive, it's the things that we choose. And so, you know, there's been, I think, some important work to sort of point in the direction of heritage also needing to embrace all of the difficult stuff that happened as well, right? Like, you know, we have to keep, when we're trying to do museology in new ways, if we just make it a free-for-all to tell new stories, you know, how do we push against these celebratory impulses so we don't tip into like new exclusivist national projects? So how do we keep that sort of tension? So how do we have a notion of heritage that is not only the things that we choose, but also the things that implicate us and define our experiences in a whole range of ways.
Sumaya, you had your hand up. And you can see this is a conversation that's blowing up really well here in the chat and question and answer. So this is lovely. Sumaya and then Aline.
So yeah, it's really fascinating. Thank you both for that. It's so thought-provoking. I kind of feel like museums are useful as they are, and I'll tell you why I say that. We live in racist societies, all of us. We live in racist societies. Like where I live right now, I live in Birmingham, and I live 5 minutes away from a school that was involved in the Trojan horse case, which if anyone has listened to the NPR podcast, I really recommend it. Britain has this word called multiculturalism, and people are very fond of this word. It's like a celebratory word, kind of like what Erica's saying, and museums love this word as well, along with words like diversity, celebratory words about what the nation is or what they think it is. But the reality is far different than that, and I on a very practical level, when I deal with curators, most of whom are white, they don't really know what society they live in, because they're not experiencing society as marginalized people do a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time. And it's quite interesting, because what museums are sort of a battleground where a lot of these things are sort of worked out, but they're part of wider society, which is also a battleground where these things are worked out. And often what I find is that museums sort of try to remove themselves from society, right? And that and sort of pretend that, well, we're sort of thinking things about society, but clearly they're not. And so what I think they're useful as they are, because they concretize, they make concrete a lot of things that seem very abstract. So we're using words like whiteness, or we're using things like racism. The thing is, it's very hard to argue whether racism is real or not, or do we live in a post-racial society or whatever, when you go into a museum and you see stolen objects. So on the other hand, I do agree with Erica, right, that it's sort of there, even whilst we're talking, there is this sense that museums can be something different, and I think people are trying. To me, that is actually the point, though, that we're meant to keep trying and failing, because the point is we live in a racist society. Trying to get out of that is problematic, right? You can't think your way out of a racist society. You can't sort of engineer yourself out of it. The whole point is that these things will not work, because we're all so imbricated and deeply woven into this that you can't do it, and the very fact that you can't do it is important in and of itself.
Aline.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, it's very interesting what Erica was saying, and it's something that I find that, so we're talking about museum, and as maybe most people know about the decolonization of the Royal African Central Museum here in Belgium, something that has been a topic for years and something that I have tried to do. And then for me, it always comes to the structural racism that's actually embedded in the Western world, if I may say like that. Although I have the impression that change is something that's needed, and that change is something that's that we want, I always find that the people, if I may say, like on top, not just on top, but that the people making the decisions, they don't want to see that change being made. Why am I saying this? It's we talk about implementing stuff, we talk about decolonization, but then when the topics is put in front and you ask opinions of the society, and those opinions are given, you always diminish the opinions that they give, and you always try. It's like a kid that is in the store and tries to cry because he wants like a packet of candy or something. If you give him a cookie, he will be happy, and you can go on doing your shopping and go home. but the issue of the fact that he wanted a package of candy is still there. And the same thing when we talk about museum as well. Like when the things that I get fed up with, it's that our opinion is asked, but when we give our opinion, it's so diminished that I always think like, oh, come on, this is not what we meant. And you do know that this is not what we meant. To give you a really like example to be able to show it, I think in the African Museum here in Belgium, there is one wall where they put down the names of all the people that died during the colonial time in Congo itself. And on that wall, it's about 100 of names. And then they wanted to do something to be able to show about the fact that colonization was a bad thing, that it's something that happens. Like, how can we kind of give a decolonization, like they call it, to this story? And our idea, well, the idea was given, but our idea was, how about putting down names of people that died and of Congolese descent themselves? What they did is taking the same period of time, the people of Congolese descent that died here in Belgium, not in Congo itself, which meant it's about 10 people. But on that time, people of Congolese descent didn't travel to Europe. They weren't living here. So how can you even compare the two? Then it's like, it's diminished, because what they're saying is like, that, look, there is 100 of people that died in Congo. Oh, but here in Belgium, there are only 10 people that died. That's kind of the thing that they are trying to tell. That's a story that they're trying to tell. But if you take the same thing and you do, that's the question that I ask, like, why didn't you just put down the names of the people that died in Congo? And the answers that they gave me was like, oh, but that's too many. And I was like, yeah, but that's the thing. That's the reason why that we put that forward. It's for you to make sure that everybody that passes here and gets to see this knows, oh my God, in Congo, although these people are dying, there were more Africans dying at that time as well. And it's the fact that you wake up people that their knowledge is not just clouded, because when you do that, you're just clouding the knowledge of people. That's the thing that I'm like, when we talk about the Decolonizing museum, we do need to think that about the fact that first, we do need to change the top. We do need to change the people that make the decisions about what enters a museum and what does not enter a museum, because apparently the culture that they don't know is not good enough to enter a museum. And as long as it's not good enough to enter a museum, the change is not going to come, or at least not a change that the population that are living the stories day by day needs to see, so that they feel a part of the whole history that they are part of. And that's just something that I wanted to add to Erica's story, because I do think that we need to make the change there before we can make any changes in the museums itself. Because for the moment, the changes that they're making is just like a small piece trying to make sure that we shut up and we go back to the background. But then the year after that, we are back to the same problem.
Thank you so much. This is really pulling a lot of things together. Sumaya, were you trying to jump in? Okay, there you go.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, I actually think that's a great example of how even the idea of the nation doesn't really make sense. That colonialism was a global thing that was often about protecting white trade, right? And so, you know, Leopold actually gave money to the university that I did my undergraduate in. And so I have a random connection to that, right? It's just, and I benefited from that, if that makes sense. And I think that this idea of sort of museums just being, you know, national institutions, that's the way they like to present themselves. But actually, they're all cogs of part of a global organization, if you like, which maintains white supremacy, but they like very much to kind of keep that idea that there are borders, they have always existed, naturalizing those borders and so on and so forth.
Great. I'd love to appreciate, and of course, Dan, you are next. I did want to say that I appreciate that you put in a link here as part of the answer to VUCA, and one of the pieces that you've done among many parts of your scholarship on Parthenon marbles and the Benin plates, and the work that could certainly start with repatriation and restoration, but it still includes many more things. And I'd love to hear what you have to say with that. And I encourage folks to continue to write very long and passionate questions here in the question and answer. And you can see that many of them intersect. So we'll be weaving some of those together here as Dan keeps us moving forward.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, and so really I just wanted to add to what's been obviously a really wonderful conversation, but that note about borders I think is so important. So the motto that I held in my head while writing my last book ran like this, which is that as the border is to the nation state, so the museum is to empire. So the border and the museum are 19th century technologies that were invented for the making of distinctions between different sorts of people. So that sort of classificatory mode, this device for making distinctions, is at the heart of what the museum is. And I think that feeds into the sense in this conversation. I mean, I keep thinking there's no book in our field that's dated so fast as that one that's called The History of the World in 100 Objects, where Neil McGregor, it's only 10 years old, you know, there's a single white UK-based male who has all the answers, 100 histories for the whole of the world. And it's that voice of authority that can tell these histories sort of using the objects, doesn't really need the objects. If you like, the histories are sort of already known, even sort of without the objects, but the role of the museological or the curatorial is to add more weight or authority, to naturalize that sort of vision. So for a long time, even at the time it came out, already curation was giving way into co-curation, which of course has all of the pitfalls, all of the risks. And Birmingham was obviously one example of how co-curation can work and also not work. And there's so much risk here that the decolonial and the co-curatorial simply becomes yet another thing that museums love. They can adopt, they can art wash, they can keep things the same, as we've heard already, just by allowing a little bit of window dressing. So I think, one example that ties all that together would be Edward Colston, where of course the removal of a statue, which as the verdict that was agreed upon by the jury underlined, that to keep something there, that was there from the later, from the 1890s, that was designed to hurt, that was designed to be a monument to sort of white supremacy. Actually, keeping it there is a hate crime. I mean, that is an act of violence in the present. Actually, that recognition was so important, and yet what did the museum do? After he went into the harbour, they fished him back out again, and they put him on sort of into M Shed, so we could have a debate, about what? About racism? About whether we like racism or not? I mean, what is that about? So that act, as I've said in my piece, I wrote about it, that act of counterinsurgency that the museum did, but in that act of removing sort of Colston, of trying to preserve him, really underlines the risks of this great rush, the race to decolonize, versus continuing to underestimate the power and the violence that sort of are built into our institutions. Ultimately in a UK context, we just need to go back to the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, after which the Macpherson report sort of introduced an idea that we still haven't adopted in terms of altering our museum practice, actually here in the UK, which is institutional racism. So these things are built into the heart of our practices, and absolutely, we need to diversify ourselves. We need to give back the stolen art. We need to remove the monuments to apartheid or to white supremacy. But we also, that, as I think others have said, the whole point is then actually what does that make possible that can happen next? So these acts of return and sort of removal are absolutely urgent and necessary, not in themselves though, in terms of what they allow to happen next.
Thank you so much. Erica, would you like to expand on that, and thinking both of Europe and its colonies, but also across Europe and in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking back to that, the question that you mentioned from the chat about sort of internal European things. And I think here, but because I work in Poland, it's important, it strikes me that it's important to consider sort of decolonizing as very much like a traveling concept. And I noticed this even myself because I'm sort of coming from Canada, where I've recently emigrated myself, but bringing the ideas which are so much about settler colonialism here to my work in Poland, and seeing sort of, well, what does that do? What fits, what doesn't fit? And, where are the snafus, and where am I seen as a neo-colonist by my very work? So I think, as the ideas of decolonization move across contexts, some of those are not even represented here. you could talk about Asia, or obviously, post-colonial places versus settler colonialism. The places had, so many places had just very different experiences of the colonial world order. And I think sometimes the conversation proceeds only from the perspective of the Western European metropoles. And the issue of the legacy of colonialism is quite complicated in East Central Europe, which did not have its own overseas colonies. Now, and I want to say that is often used as an excuse. And so this is not to say that Poland and countries in the region were not fully entangled in the global colonial matrix of power as beneficiaries and also as aspirants. So just because they didn't have colonies doesn't mean they didn't want colonies, would have liked colonies. But I think what counts as colonialism, who were colonialism's victims and perpetrators, is very complicated in East Central Europe, because when the discourse is used, Poland tends to see itself as a victim of the colonialism perpetrated by the Austrians, Germans, Soviets, and even the EU today, rather than using the idea of decolonizing culture to consider how Poles have treated or depicted others, right? And so, so that's a problem, obviously. But it is also true that we have to nuance the ideas of coloniality and decoloniality that talk quite simply about white supremacy when we're thinking across Europe. So notions of race and notions of whiteness get complicated in Eastern Europe because that's part of Europe that itself has a long history of subjugation and racialization by Western Europeans or by the local nobility. So if we're thinking about the history of serfdom and indentured labor, right? And this touched majority populations like Slavs, and then also minority populations within Slavic countries like the Roma people and the Jews. So this is to say that multiple colonial legacies exist simultaneously. There are material institutional legacies of both the exoticization and racialization of overseas and internal others, and legacies of East Central European countries being dominated by neighboring empires. So the tricky question, I guess, boiled down is how to try to decolonize museums in the East Central European context without imposing a new hegemony that erases their experience, right? So it's kind of a loop, but I think that conversation is only beginning to be had, and differentiating those Europes is a key piece here.
Mm-hmm. Sumaya, I think you wanted something to add in that also. And I'm happy also to hear about concrete examples, how different kinds of museums are doing this, both with objects, but also stories and also curation. How do you see these things happening that relate to the big issues that we've been bringing up that underlie the challenge of decolonizing?
Oh, I love Erica's point. And actually, this is one of the reasons that I don't actually like using the word decolonizing, because in my view, it's I think even the fact that we're just kind of throwing it around and we haven't actually defined it, and it isn't definable, and there's all these kind of problems with it, because in the end, it sort of feels a bit like who gets to imagine the future, right? Like who gets to imagine what a decolonial world looks like? And when you look at it from a different perspective, whether that be from a settler colonial society or post-colonial society, you're going to have very different perspectives. You're going to have different experience of how colonialism impacted you and your society. So I'm always very aware of that, and I think it's such a good point that often these conversations not only do they happen in the metropole, so to speak, they also tend to happen in universities and museums. So it's sort of like the most elite places in those places, and it tends to be, it tends to be that in my view, that sort of seems to happen in those places for a particular reason, which is that those radical aims are diluted basically by the very fact that we are having these conversations here and continuously using that word, but what do we mean by it, and so on, if that makes sense. So yeah, that was what I wanted to add.
I think those are really important questions as we think about who museums serve, who are there on the staff, who are the leadership folks, what kind of relationships do they have as networks with other kinds of museums in other places, especially places that have been the original cultures of things that are displayed either as natural history objects or even as art objects. That's a question that Brad brings in is, what do we think of as culture, civilization, what belongs in museums and is worthy of that, and or which things become completely wrapped up in the public eye about what the cost or issues are in returning it. Why do some things become easy to think about and others are radically resisted? And I think, of course, of Nefertiti all by herself in her own room there in the new museum in Berlin. And, she has her own guards even, because that is a difficult thing for them to think about giving back versus others' objects that they hold. The folks in the chat are very interested in thinking about how this might really become a new way, not just of thinking about displaying things, but working with people. And I think that happens on two levels. One, trying to find ways that curators and the folks working in museums can deal with the really sincere and deep trauma, the violence, the effects of folks who come to museums and see themselves or see the history there or see the history of where they're currently living as an unfinished, unresolved traumatic event. So thinking about how we might do that kind of curation with people, but also then think about how we might build alliances in those communities. And I'd love to hear from some of you who are actively working with other community groups or are working in other kinds of advocacy spaces to see how museums are doing their humane and human work of decolonizing and moving even beyond that term. So of course, here I see Aline's hand up, so we'll start with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that the question totally comes in the field that I am in, because I'm not just at a university. I am actually in between the different societies and in between the different, diverse African communities that live in Belgium. And the thing that we're doing is working towards working together with the Africa Museum to be able to see how that they can be a change, or how that we can be implicated in their way of doing or thinking. We don't want to be part of them, unfortunately, because we don't believe in the way that they take on things and on the way that they do things and the way that they make decisions as well. As one thing that we have seen that our voice doesn't really matter when it comes to implementing stuff or changing stuff. So for us, it's how can we still make a difference for the society and make a change without being taken into their way of thinking and their way of doing that. And that's kind of like an important thing that we are trying to do. And the thing that we have asked is the fact that although we know that they don't want to make the changes that we want to make to the museum, or the changes that we think that the society wants to make to the museum, or especially for me, tell the stories that I want to hear when they talk about the fact that they colonized the country that I came from, where I was born in. It's something that that we are looking for. Like, how can we make sure that even the groups that go through that museum at least get part of the story from people who tell it in other ways, who have been through the trauma that we're talking about here today? How can we make sure that it's not just something that another white person is telling, or another person who has no idea what's going on, it's just telling from hearsay, instead of just like, I know somebody who did this, or I know somebody who came from there. How can we make sure that the stories are told by the diaspora themselves, by people that can make sure that the emotions that they want to give through to other people are told? And that's why we are trying to build up a new sort of, collaboration, where we are going to be able to tell our own stories ourselves. Whether we are not going to be able to change the museum, but aside from the museum, where we want to get the space so that groups can afterwards at least have the ability of reaching us easily, much more easily, to hear the stories from we ourselves. Because there is one thing that I always say is, like, when you look at a documentary, you see the emotions. The people are telling their own stories. It's not just somebody talking over them and telling their stories. No, it's people really showing the emotions of what they went through and what they lived through. And that kind of way of thinking does help people to kind of empathize with the person in the documentary itself. And that's a thing that I think needs to be created in most of the museums as well, is how can we make sure that the story is told by somebody who has been traumatically through all of this, or can feel the pain that's needed to be felt, and that can bring it over to other people as well. That's the way that we are working today, and trying to make sure that those stories come into the museums. And hopefully when the director change and there is a structure change, we can even bring that into the history itself, and that it's told on the way that we think that should be told. But for the moment, it's a small part and it's a starting point. And we are hoping that it can follow, and that generations to come can actually have a much louder voice than we have at the moment.
I'm so glad to see how many things are happening, and perhaps doing partnerships where possible, and also really speaking firsthand. And I appreciate also that so much of this is done with new forms of media and direct person-to-person kind of communication, because that human aspect is why many of us miss being in museums, being there with our school kids, with our families, with our friends, with our discussion partners, to be in a space live. And that's been a real challenge during COVID, to not have many of those same spaces, to be able to have sort of, certainly not neutral ground, but a place that is sort of like a jumping off point or a pushback point. And I'd love to hear more of ways that each of you have found positive, sort of good examples, either inside or outside of museums, where they're working on new forms of curation and new forms of partnership with other community organizations that are striving to tell different approaches and do it in new ways. Erica.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, again, I want to just, I feel like I'm working in this kind of radically different context, but I think it does maybe open up to the idea of how much the context, the national and maybe also, you know, sort of cultural or continental, depending on where we are, that the context really matters. So, you know, Poland has, in a sense, a kind of real broad indifference to the decolonial debates that refer to the global South, right? Obviously, like, you know, there's all of this hotbed of debates around museums in terms of, you know, Poland as victim, but I think the indifference, it has a few reasons. One is there's no government support because there's a very conservative right-wing government. There's no civil society kind of whatever that say pressure or that general culture would be, because it's such a, I mean, I think Poland is like around 96% maybe uniformly white, Slavic, Catholic, you know, like there isn't a tradition of thinking in the post-war generations of Poland as multiculturalism as a good thing. And also in relation to that, I always think of change in museums really being catalyzed by activist members of the aggrieved communities who feel ill-treated by museums as the ones who then push back. And in Poland, there's, again, because of the demographics I mentioned, there's a lack of sufficiently large or empowered communities that would sort of take that on as that in that catalyst role. There's also a lack of general knowledge even about what exists in Polish museums, like what are the colonial era collections in terms of global colonialism, where are they, how were they gotten? But I just wanted to say that it's such exciting work that we're starting to do. I have a grant with a Polish colleague and a bunch of students who are literally just trying to map out what exists, but also an important part of our work is to find strategies to engage representatives of the communities that either are implicated in museum collections or should be implicated in what museums do, just in terms of representing the societies that they're in. So, trying to engage them in this work. So Afro-Poles, Vietnamese Poles, Muslims, Ukrainians, Jews, like how can we catalyze them and amplify their voices on what their needs and challenges would be in relation to museums? But the context is just trying to suggest that this is such sort of tiny seedlings of groundwork in a really, hostile, it doesn't quite capture it, just sort of a part of the world where this stuff gets a big shrug, or the sense of this really doesn't apply to us. That said, as a last note, there are some very exciting, there's some few activist, wonderful curators that are working against all of these pressures. And even on sort of a large scale, one might note that this year's representative for the Polish pavilion at the Venice Biennale is Małgorzata Mirgatas, who is a Romani feminist activist. I could mention some other small, one-off exhibitions, but things are happening. There's just, we're trying to sort of map out, and also, what would it take to connect these people in that kind of environment, or maybe really in a cross-European or a global environment. I think international partnerships and connections, they can't solve the problem of lack of space for independent culture, but they can certainly help. And I think to the extent that we can seed that and sort of support that, it's worthwhile.
Okay, thank you, Sumaya. I'm hoping also just to let you know that we're surprisingly already at 1:15. So I'm hoping that we can also continue to make sure that everybody gets a good long last chance to talk about things that you see that you think are really important, that you want to make sure that you get a chance to say here before we begin our wrap up.
Okay. So just to continue what Erica was saying, actually a very recent exhibition I went to was at the Ashmolean, which is and it was about Iraq, and the name of the exhibition, I cannot remember the exact name of it. It involved using co-curators, so people that were part from, so I think from Iraq, or people who are from more marginalized communities, to co-curate the exhibition. And Ashmolean sort of has like a life-size sort of thing of like Lawrence of Arabia, and it's very much not the kind of place that would do a project like that. So I agree that with Erica that there is a lot of interesting work that I think museums are trying to sort of break down their hierarchies to a certain extent. However, a bit like sort of what Aline says, I think is true, which is the part of the issue is that when you have these lived experiences, which is a powerful form of knowledge, it sort of puts you in an odd position with curators. And that's something that I have had a kind of weird experiences with, which is that a lot of people sort of don't think of lived experience as legitimate as maybe a degree, for instance, or as legitimate as a curatorial experience and that type of thing, if that makes sense. And also there comes the question of things like remuneration and like how do you ethically engage with people from marginalized communities in a museum. So I think that although there are really great things happening, part of what's interesting or great about it is it raises these other questions about how do you ethically negotiate with these issues. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. your question is so important, and thinking about ethics can mean so many different things to different people as far as what their current needs are, what their needs for reconciliation and restitution are. Alexandra wrote a new question into the question and answer section, and she asks, hello, I'm curious to hear what panelists think about creating sites such as the Memento Park in the suburbs of Budapest, Hungary, that became a site where communist statues went to, quote, die. Is that the right way of presenting history and displaying works of art, or one of the options? And as you think about that, I see Dan's ready to jump in. My own work and visits at multiple times here to the Africa Museum certainly leads that they're using several different approaches to that, including something not quite called the memento room. It's more of like the basement white room of shame that they've moved many of the statues in. But they've also chosen to preserve some of the ones that were built in as integral parts of the North Rotunda, and very much keep them as objects of conversation and very frank ways of looking at representation. And they're shared in a space with modern artists from the Congo and other places, including statues that then look at each other and interact. So Dan, do you have something here to add to this overall conversation too about things and interactions and how new forms of curation are moving?
And so thanks, yeah. And so yes, it was on that issue of what to do with the fallen idols, really. And so in the chat earlier on, I put a link to the piece I just wrote about toxic monumentality, where I talk about the Berlin version of that same approach of here are all in Spandau in Berlin. There is this exhibit of the former colonial Prussian, the former communist, and the former Nazi statues. What I think we learned from that, though, is that there are certain forms of the monumental which are partly what we're dealing with. So I could, exactly as others, in order to answer the wider question, I could list a lot of examples of best practice, and I also linked to the work that Ashmolean have been doing that as I just that we just heard about. But I worry about that because in some cases, this isn't, in anthropology museums, this isn't simply about the misrepresentation of one culture or another. That has been a central part of what has been going on. But at the same time, sort of institutions like Ashmolean or Pitt Rivers here in Oxford have also been about the enaction of cultural whiteness. So whether that's in a statue of a general or whether that's in the presentation of objects that were stolen as if they are there to create an image of the so-called primitive or sort of exotic, that ultimately is about, or was about in the late 19th century, the racialization of the curator, of the visitor as sort of culturally white. So that's at the heart of it. What we need to look at is, all of this work is so important and so urgent. What do we do with all the white people in all of this as well? How do we see in the galleries that are about ancient Greece or about Europe, seeing as that's the sort of the frame that we're looking at in terms of seeking to abolish that image that Europe has anything to do with something sort of meaningful that we'd call sort of cultural whiteness. That work of abolition then is not over. And I think we just need, when we're talking about working with wider communities, it risks simply being art wash, being sort of culture wash, sort of if we're not addressing these issues over our role, our ongoing relationship to white supremacy.
Can I just jump in, Maureen? I think that it sort of has to happen in a dual way, because I think the problem is that when we talk about white people and white supremacy, So just recently, I've just finished an essay called "Museums Are Temples of Whiteness," and I this is truly my belief, and I think I think that there's some very deep things happening when a white person enters a museum that has not really been written that much about, right? Have this idea that museums are secular, and that you go into them and you become a perfect citizen and you walk out and it's a great day out for everyone, and that's truly my belief. At the same time, I recognize, and I can't see the chat, but I can imagine the chat is asking for, what about hope? And where's the optimism? And be constructive. I have heard that for the last 5 years. So I'm always trying to sort of accept that people are trying, but at the same time, getting people to accept that their whole civilization is based upon, and their conception of their civilization is based upon exploitation, genocide, and theft, and that it continues to be that way. Because actually, Erica, you reminded me that, you know, Ireland and Scotland often are kind of forgotten in this debate, and they also function, as you were saying, is they're both, you know, it's both colonies, but then also they became white. That whiteness, and so that these are much more complex, and I recognize that we simplify, but in terms of you know, I think that the kind of projects that, especially when we're regarding to the Ashmolean, what I found interesting, particularly in the exhibition at the Ashmolean, was that there was an art installation. I think talking about what art can bring to the conversation is important. There was an art installation of destruction in the middle of the room. A destruction, like actually just rubble in the corner of this museum, which is bizarre because museums are places that are meant to be of order and categorization and kind of a particular neat, well-lit type of thing. And so it's important to kind of, that's just my perspective though, right, that we need to sort of talk about it in this dual way. We have our kind of academic stuff to do with, you know, what I believe in. Museums are temples of whiteness, that's what I believe. At the same time, to recognize as people operating beneath these huge institutions with these huge ideologies, how do we navigate that? I feel like these are slightly different questions that are intersecting, and that's my philosophy, I suppose.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Aline, and then I want to make sure everybody has a chance to have one more comment of, you've got a captive audience here. You've got one that's being recorded for folks to listen to you again and again, to hear what you deeply have to say, and to be able to say something that you want them to take home with them, to think about and to trouble themselves with, to sit with. But Aline, I know you wanted to jump in onto this, wrapping up this conversation, and then I will just go in just the same way, just so you know when you're coming. Erica, Dan, Sumaya, and then Aline as the last word. Okay.
Yeah, I will really be quick. It's just something that listening to all of this, and the question that what was raised, where you kind of about the monuments that were put together in a corner. For me, it's something that I always ask, like, so when you do that helps the people to know why you're doing it. Like for me, because the first thing you enter the African Museum is that place that you're talking about. It's quite centered. It's actually quite, it's right on, like it's something that you enter and you see it right away. And I'm wondering, like, isn't that the wrong way of going on things? But it's something that more and more is actually being done. It's something that people are actually choosing to, in different ways, honestly, in very different ways. But it's something that I'll always ask myself, like, although you are trying to make a statement about the fact that those artifacts or those those images are not the right images to be shown. So why are they still shown? Because for me, when I see them and I see the way that they're projected, and now especially they're put in front of each other as if they're fighting, actually, you are still telling a story. It's not that you're taking the story away. It's actually telling a story in a different way, where you tell another story on top of it, trying to make it okay about the story that you're telling. And for me, it's where when you talk about the debate, and I am listening to the debate, is whether you need to think that, okay, before we do all of this, before we tell again another story into the story that we already have, that is already negative, how can we not continue to make it negative? Because by collecting the negativity and putting it in one place doesn't change or doesn't tell a different story or doesn't help anybody having the knowledge that it needs to be told another way. It's just something that I wanted to add for the lady or the guy who asked the question, that for me, I understand what they try to do, but it's just still the same thing. They're not changing anything.
Thank you. I know it's impossible to summarize very quickly, but Erica, what would you like to leave us with? And then Dan and Sumaya.
Yeah, so much fascinating stuff has been said. It's hard to follow all this or try to sum anything up. But I think, thinking about this sort of decolonization of museums in as a sort of trend, as maybe a buzzword, I think what I'm wondering about is, like, how can museums cultivate community partners that aren't sort of part of their roster of the usual suspects who, in a possibly tokenistic manner, sort of get called in so that they can show that there's been some diversity, and sort of cultivate relationships with people who maybe haven't thought of the museum as actually a place for them, or that they would want to engage with, because as Sumaya said, maybe it's just a temple to whiteness. I'm sure that there are people out there who would love to have a say, who have not had a say. How to connect with them, how to bring them into museums, and how to give them some real power. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Dan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with the point that Erica just made. It's really important who's in the conversation. How do we ensure that the conversation involves the wider communities, stakeholders, audiences that we say in the museums that we serve? But to sum up, I'd say, I mean, this for me, the way that I'm trying to frame it in the writing I'm doing at the moment sort of runs like this. It's that in terms of the natural world, in terms of natural history, in terms of environmentalism, we are rightly told that the challenge is how to be a good ancestor, how to leave a world behind us that's not full of toxic things, and overheated worlds, nuclear waste, plastics, all that stuff. That's absolutely right. But what about those of us who work not in natural history, but in cultural history? What about sort of culture? And I'd argue that for our field, it's exactly the inverse, that our sort of challenge is how to be a good descendant, how to inherit what's good from the past, because we don't simply have to burn every museum down to the ground, but not holding back and excising and refusing to inherit those things which are hurtful and toxic for us and for our world in the present.
Sumaya and Aline.
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
I think that for me, these questions are urgent because it's about how do we live together, right? How we live together in ways that are ethical, moral, complex, but as Dan says, the idea that within a healthy society, we would hope that criticality and dissent as well is something that is the center of our society, right? At the same time, it's interesting that we're making a kind of distinction between natural history and other disciplines, because obviously when I think of natural history, I also think of colonization. And for me, it's about dissolving these barriers between these issues. So climate change is a colonial issue and a colonial creation as well. And I feel that at the core, it's about trying to get people to understand the urgency of these things, and the interconnectedness of these things, and to stop thinking about these things as siloed issues. And the more that we can get experts and people who are perhaps not working in these fields to recognize how actually everything that we do and everything that we are is connected to these longer histories and have profound repercussions for what we do next, as different communities, but as a collective as well. I think that that will hopefully help us live in a better world.
Yeah, I'm next. So for me, just to close it up, I always think like I'm working in a field where we are up to action and now. Why? Because we want to make sure that the next generation doesn't have the same questions as we are wondering today, but hopefully we can give them answers, or we can give them at least a way for them to be able to do things. So I'm hoping, I always have this in my mind where I say, like, my mom used to be the one that was complaining about it. I have to be the one that takes the action. And today, being able to be part of this conversation is something that I do, because I do believe the more people that can be informed, or the more people that can hear these opinions of people that are on the floor that don't actually get the chance to voice their opinions and get to be part of all of this, because we are not professors, and we always talk about out of experience, not out of numbers or out of books. We always talk about the experience that we went through. And it's sometimes really difficult to sit around a table because they don't acknowledge the fact that you have the same knowledge as they have, although you haven't had all the schooling that they might have. And it's something that I can just only give to everybody today. The more you listen, the more you take part to these groups that are, minorities or not part of it, the more that you're gonna be at least able to take those voices and implement them in those institutional structures that we are trying to break down, that we are trying to change. So I'm hoping really that from today, if anybody learned anything, try to listen. It's one thing that I can honestly give to you guys. If you're working in a museum, talk to the people. Honestly, I cannot just say it enough. It's not easy. We are not always as open as we should be, because we have seen enough, we have been through enough, but honestly, that's all I can give tonight. Thank you for inviting me to be able to be part of this conversation, for sure.
It has been an absolute pleasure to be able to be here today with all of you. I'm so glad that this has continued to be an emphasis here at the University of Pittsburgh and in the International Institute for International Studies and Education. This is certainly a project that is ongoing and fundamentally important to so many different stakeholders and so many different constituencies. I appreciate all the ideas, including Bharti Lawani, who just posed another question too about good brainstorming about how to keep on moving. And I'm really looking forward to all the folks who will see this recording and add their questions. We will be adding the things that have been in the chat and in the questions as far as resources, so that everyone can continue this mutual sharing well into the future. Thank you so much for being able to be part of this conversation. It's sad to have to close it at this point for today, but we will continue, and I will turn it over now to our overall host, my friend and colleague, Alison Delnor.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you everybody for what has truly been an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. And we got a lot of great questions, so thanks to the audience that joined us. I just want to say that there is a link to a survey in the chat that I hope that people will take a moment to complete. These questions are ongoing. This does not end here. In addition to the fact that our next conversation next month is going to kind of continue some of these themes of restitution, but we'll be looking at reparations in Europe and this issue of reparations for past atrocities. And we're going to continue the conversation even beyond that as part of our critical area studies of Europe initiative, which we call the CASE initiative, where basically we're just trying to do exactly what I think was described at the very end there in the summary remarks, is just figure out how area studies, which was born of both sort of colonialism and the Cold War, how we can do it better moving forward if we're going to continue to have centers such as ours exist. So please continue the conversation. Please keep engaging with us. And we look forward to hearing more. Thank you all. Goodbye.